Welcome to the program today. Mondo Gonzalez here in studio, but by Skype with Dr. Titus Kennedy. We're going to be doing a archaeology update. But before we do, I want to remind everybody that we have a prophecy conference in March. And so if you want to come and join us in Orlando, it's going to be a great time. Over 900 people. We've got 15 different speakers. You can go to our website, prophecywatchers.com, to get more information about that. It's a great time to be in Florida in March. The weather's decent, and if you're somewhere cold, come join us. Also in March, it's going to be a busy month for us. We are going to be in Israel. And so we invite you to come join us. We're going to be doing 10 days in Israel as well as a few days in Jordan, going to Petra as well as Mount Nebo and a couple other sites. So if you want information about that, go to visitisraeltoday.com, or you can just email us and ask for information. But the itinerary's there. It's going to be a great time, very reasonable price for everybody. And there's no medical requirements, no testing, no vaccinations. And so things are really opening up in Israel right now. They're actually on pace for some of the pre-2020 numbers. So people are going. And so we invite you to come with us. But Dr. Titus Kennedy, welcome.
Hey, Mondo. Thanks for having me back on your show.
Yeah, it's great to have you back. And, as always, you're a PhD archaeologist. You've been doing a lot of things. One of the things I love most about you is you believe the Bible's true, which is awesome. And for those that might not know you, we get new visitors, new viewers all the time. Kind of give a little background about who you are, where people can find out more information about you, and also about the couple books that you've written recently, which I think are tremendous.
Sure. Well, as you said, I'm an archaeologist, and I specialize in biblical archaeology, so the regions of the ancient Near East and the Mediterranean world. And I have done archaeological excavations and surveys at 17 different sites now in several countries. But, really my focus has been especially on what we call the late Bronze Age, which is sort of Moses, Joshua, Judges type of time period, and also on the time of Jesus in the New Testament, the Roman period. I've been an adjunct professor at Biola University for quite a few years now, so it's where I do some of my teaching as well as other places for special lectures and seminars. And I'm a fellow at the Discovery Institute up in Seattle there, and still participating in excavations, although the last couple of years have been tough with that. I have been digging in Armenia recently, and I hope to get back into some of the major biblical sites in this coming year.
Yeah, I mean, what I appreciate too is that a lot of archaeologists can be professors or teachers or whatever, but man, you are very much in the field, and so as it relates to, again, 17 sites is pretty impressive. One of the things that we've covered here before is you have your book Unearthing the Bible, as well as Excavating the Evidence for Jesus, which kind of give us a brief summary of both of those, because I've read them. We've done interviews, but for those that might not know, I cannot recommend these resources highly enough, because if you like archaeology and you love to see the evidence which leads to the historical reliability of Scripture, these books are awesome.
Oh, thank you. So Unearthing the Bible is focusing on archaeological artifacts, or these ancient objects that connect to the Bible, both Old and New Testament. So the book is arranged chronologically, and I start with the earliest time period and some of the earliest artifacts, and I go all the way through the time of Acts and the epistles. And every entry is an artifact, and there's at least one photograph of it. Sometimes I talk about another related artifact in that entry, but so there's over 100 artifacts in there, and it's written in such a way as to get the main information in it and the biblical references that are connected, and to see how it either illuminates a section of the Bible or it demonstrates the historical reliability through archaeological discoveries. And then my second book, Excavating the Evidence for Jesus, that's written in a bit of a different way. So it's more of a traditional book divided into chapters where you're going through the life of Jesus. And again, I arranged it chronologically to make logical sense of things. So starting with the background right before the birth of Jesus, and then going all the way to the resurrection and the ascension, and looking at all the archaeological sites that are connected to locations mentioned in the Gospels, people who are named in the Gospels, who we also have evidence of from archaeological inscriptions or coins or historical manuscripts, and then events also. So again, this book would help to illuminate the historical context of the Gospels, the very immediate historical context, especially the places and the culture and the people, but also all of the more definitive or absolute connections that we have between archaeology and what is written in the Gospels and about the life of Jesus. And I, again, included a lot of pictures. I think that's very important when learning archaeology or reading about archaeology, so that you can actually see those things because they still exist. They're there.
In my mind, I think that every parent or grandparent should, both of these books should be given to their grandsons or granddaughters or whatever, parents, teenagers, because I would love to capture their minds, especially for those that are being raised in a Christian and biblical environment. I'd love to capture their minds so that when they get to college and they hear some of these outlandish things that, there really isn't any proof that Jesus existed, or there's really no evidence for the reliability of the Gospels. You got, other books, I don't want to even name them. I don't want to even give them credence, but, your books tackle that head on as it relates to, it's not a theology book. It's not about faith. It's not about tradition. It's about the facts that are being pulled out of the ground, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I intentionally just talk about history and archaeology in the book. I don't get into theology. That also would require a lot more word count, and we've got restrictions on that. And of course, people usually don't want to pick up a 600-page book, and it looks daunting. So, yeah, it's focused on the archaeology of Jesus and try to just keep it the straight facts, and so that even someone who is a skeptic of the Gospels or a skeptic of the historical evidence for Jesus can read through it and see that there's a lot of objective evidence for the life of Jesus. It's not just theological ideas or Christian texts that are making claims that aren't backed by any physical evidence.
Let's go back to your area of expertise, because one of the things that popped up on my feed a few days ago was a conversation that you were having with Dr. Sean McDowell. He's an apologist. His dad is Josh McDowell, right? And so people know, again, he does a lot, again, apologetics, defending the faith. And he was talking to you about the Exodus, and that kind of goes back to your expertise, the area of your expertise. Kind of shape, if you will, the discussion and some of the ways in the part of the conversation that you were having there.
So we were talking about the historical and archaeological evidence for the Exodus, or at least some of the main points of that. And I tried to present a simple argument of sort of A to B. So we have the Hebrews in point A in Egypt at time 1, and then we have the Israelites pop up in Canaan, point B at time 2. And so there's some kind of migration exodus there. And so we talk about what's the evidence for Hebrews in Egypt prior to the Exodus. Are there any connections, sort of a more direct attestation of an Exodus event, and then showing up in Canaan after that. And in addition to just the evidence connected to that story, we also talked just a little about there's some different ideas for the Exodus, the historicity of it, or when it happened. And so there are, essentially we could say there are 3 views. And the first is that the Exodus happened, and it happened when the Bible said it happened. And the second is that the Exodus happened, or something similar to the Exodus perhaps happened, but it happened in a slightly different time period. And there are variations on this, but then we have the third view, that the Exodus did not happen. It's just totally mythological. And that's actually the one that is predominant today in scholarship. And so we're discussing, what's the evidence now? And is any of this evidence new in a sense of the past few decades or so, before it became more solidified in scholarship that the Exodus didn't happen. But there's been discoveries since that time. It just hasn't been discussed, or the Exodus has been written off as a dead issue, and so often it's not really looked at by a lot of scholars.
Yeah. Based on all the stuff that you've done and all the latest things that are coming out, again, as you know, as you mentioned, you go back 50 years ago, mythology, and of course some of that continues to this day, but based on what you understand, not only with our Egyptian archaeology, but as well as biblical archaeology and how they kind of meld, and even Mesopotamian archaeology, is there enough evidence that presents a very compelling case for the way that the Bible says it, or are we still lacking? Not that, again, absence of evidence is evidence of absence, and that's the whole phrase, but would you say that there's enough there to make a compelling case?
I believe that there is enough there to make a compelling case. I would not say that there is enough there to make such a definitive case that nearly everyone is going to accept it. There's no smoking gun, so to speak. It's not quite like the Tell Dan Steely and its connection to David. There's not an Egyptian text that talks about Moses leading a group of people out, right? But there are a lot of data points that connect to the Exodus story and the overall narrative. And then with the conquest, I actually think that is even a stronger case archaeologically than the Exodus at this point. But certainly when you put it all together, I do think it is very compelling. But there's also room for additional discoveries that may be more convincing to a lot of people that are skeptical or sort of on the fence about the reliability of that account.
As we go back in time, we can go back maybe to the time of, let's say, Isaiah, or then, David and Solomon, roughly 1000 BC, into the Judges, and then going back to the conquest, and then, to the Exodus period, and then even to Abraham. And so Abraham's kind of in Genesis 12 kind of been this marker, but what would we expect the archaeological record to show as we go back in time? I mean, what's the reality of archaeology going back?
Generally, if you go back farther and farther in time, you're going to have less archaeological material. Now, it's going to vary by the type of material and the site you're looking at, but if we say, for example, we have an archaeological site, and every 100 years or something, there's a city that's destroyed or rebuilt or abandoned or something like that. So we have all these different layers. Now, the ancients often reused materials, and so those early layers are going to be lacking things. Certain types of materials just get destroyed with time. And then we also don't have as many texts from the really ancient periods. I mean, you think about the earliest writing, it was basically economic and administrative in nature. It was quite basic. Very, very few people actually knew how to read and write, so they didn't have books or scrolls all over the place. So as you move forward in time, there are more sites, there are more people, there are larger cities, there's more writing, there's a potential for more preservation. And that's why when we look at, say, things from the time of Jesus during the Roman period, there's a vast amount of archaeological material. But you go back to someone like Abraham in his time period, and we don't know nearly as much. And there are even huge debates within scholarship about the chronology of Mesopotamia around that time period. And, 4 different major chronologies for Mesopotamia. So it is a lot more enigmatic when you go back farther in time. And when you're also looking at, say, an individual or a small tribe of people versus a kingdom, an empire, a king, you're going to probably not find much, if anything, that is pointing specifically to that person.
It's interesting that within the biblical world, Israel, Syria, Lebanon, maybe down to Egypt, they talk about maybe less than 3%, 1% have been excavated. So to me, with that being the number, still the amount of information and archaeology that has come out that helps lend credibility certainly to the reliability of Scripture is amazing with having 1%.
Sure, statistically, it really seems like the level of archaeological material that's connecting to the Bible is quite high in comparison to overall. One explanation for that might be that there's been much more archaeological work done in Bible lands, what we might call. But yeah, there's so much more that has never been excavated, and potential for all these other discoveries, and yet with the little that we have, we do have so much information.
I think it's amazing too, some of the things that you said, where it's very common to have one civilization build on top of the other. I think like at Megiddo, there's over 20 or 25 different civilizations in the stratigraphy there. But we also see that as they come, they reuse things, which contaminates a clear historical definitive explanation sometimes, because they might have used this multiple times. You're like, hey man, you just ruined what we would have saw.
Right, yeah, and that's always an issue when doing excavations, is to understand the layers and understand what has been reused, what buildings have been reused and for how long, or even artifacts sometimes that may survive centuries even, depending on what they are. And then to recognize that there could have been other important artifacts here, especially when we're talking about precious metals, but they got melted down and reused.
You mentioned the Tel Dan stele, and here back in 1993, if people look this up, here this little piece that was just kind of used in a wall, wasn't it? It wasn't even, it was like this stone that was reused it was a written stone inscribed, but reused as part of a wall. I don't know if I remember it right, but here it was. Where's the other parts of this whole thing? And here they didn't care about the writing on it. They just needed to fix the wall.
Right, yeah. So that was a victory stele that Aram erected at Dan after they conquered that city. And then when the Israelites retook it, they seemingly smashed the victory stele of their enemies, which would make sense. And they reused it in this courtyard in front of the city gate. And so, initially that one piece was found, but then they found other fragments of the stele since then.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. Well, let's talk about some of I want to give an archaeology update here. In the sense of, there's been some stuff that has been discovered recently that just came out in the past few weeks as it relates to the gospel city of Bethsaida, which is on the northeastern side of the Sea of Galilee. This is a city that is well known in the gospel. Give a little bit of background of what we know from the gospels about this city related to Jesus and the apostles, and then kind of give us a run through of the latest discovery and maybe a little bit of the controversy of some different competing sites.
Sure. So Bethsaida is mentioned not often in the Gospels, but a bit. It is attested, and it is called the hometown of Peter and Andrew. So that's where they originated from. It's not where they were living at the time of the Gospels, because Peter at least had moved to Capernaum, and we see his mother-in-law's house mentioned in Capernaum, and it seems like he's probably living in that house too. But Bethsaida is, of course, on the lake there, and they go over to that area multiple times in the Gospels. So it's a site where we have some information about. We should be able to locate it. It's moderately important in terms of the Gospels narrative. And so many of these sites in Galilee have been located, definitively located, and some excavations carried out there. Well, Bethsaida, there's some controversy around which archaeological site is to be identified with Bethsaida of Galilee or Bethsaida of the Gospels. The one that most people would know about, at least over the last several years or a couple of decades, it's even called Tel Bethsaida, is the archaeological site is called Et Tel, and it is located about 1.5 miles off of the coast of the Sea of Galilee, or the ancient coastline, which the ancient coastline is basically today's coastline.
Because that's far, 1.5 miles. That's pretty far away to be a fishing village, huh?
And it's also about 23 feet higher in elevation from the coast. So there have always been scholars who were skeptical of identifying that as Bethsaida of the Gospels because of its distance from the lake and the elevation difference. And, you go to Capernaum and it's right there on the lake. You can go up to the shoreline. You go to Magdala. It's the same thing for all these sites. So that was curious. And the explanation was that there was some earthquake that rose that particular part, up in elevation, but seemingly didn't damage the site. And then that the lake, receded then. But again, that's not what we see with the other villages. This alternative site called El Araj has been excavated, and quite a bit of it has been written on that, arguing for it being Bethsaida. And it's got first century remains there, which are dated by pottery and coins. It's got structures. It's right on the coast of the lake on that northeastern side. And then they found a Byzantine church there. And
what's for those that might not know, what's Byzantine? What's the time frame? What's Byzantine? Give us a time frame.
So the Byzantine period in the Holy Land would start in the 4th century AD. So this is after Christianity is declared legal by Constantine. And this is when churches, actual official church buildings, begin to be built. And so this Byzantine period, it varies when we would say it stops, but it goes at least into the 6th century, sometimes longer in other places.
So basically 300 to 600 AD.
Yeah. That's generally what we're looking at in the Holy Land for Byzantine period. But there were lots of churches built during that time period, and they are almost exclusively churches that are associated with ancient biblical sites, or something of importance in the biblical narrative. And so when they found this church at El Araj, which they were arguing was Bethsaida, to them it seemed like the early Christians were saying this was a biblical site or a gospel site, a Jesus-associated site, and that substantiates or helps to substantiate that this would be the site of Bethsaida, because it could have been a church dedicated to Peter and Andrew, which is actually talked about in an 8th century text. And Eusebius says that Bethsaida was occupied during the Byzantine period in the 4th century. Okay, so there's some things we should expect, right? So that was helpful, I think, in establishing more plausibility. The other site, Et Tel Bethsaida, farther from the lake, it does indeed have Roman period remains too, but again, it's far from the lake, and there's no Byzantine church, no kind of early Christian presence like that, or monument that's been located yet. So I think it's fallen out of favor a little bit. Then there's this new discovery, right? You were looking at that.
Yep. Because as you mentioned earlier in the conversation, that one of the things that archaeologists probably hope for, I would say maybe in the top 2, you can tell me, you're a field archaeologist, is one of the best things that you can ever find is an inscription. That truly is like, okay, because it's just so helpful. So they found an inscription. Talk about the inscription that they found at this particular site.
Yeah, so this summer, as they were continuing excavations there, they were digging up more of this Byzantine period church, and they got to a mosaic floor. So there's these mosaics, they're tiny little cubes of stone, and very often they would make designs out of these cubes and even text. So especially at churches of this period, they would have Bible verses, or they would talk about the deacons or who dedicated this church and some other kind of Christian message. Well, in this inscription or in this mosaic text that they found at El Araj, it talks about the chief and commander of the apostles, who it doesn't say Peter, at least on the part of the inscription that they've uncovered, but that is who Peter is. And that same phraseology is found in the Byzantine period, and he was regarded in that position, right? And Paul's obviously very prominent, but if you read Acts, like who's the leader of the apostles there in Acts, the early Acts? It's Peter. So then they could see, this church actually is directly connected to the apostle Peter, which then kind of seals it that this is the church that's dedicated to Peter and maybe Andrew also, because this was their hometown. And therefore, it would be Bethsaida of the Gospels. And I think that probably was a clincher discovery. And really now there's an extremely strong case for El Araj being Bethsaida.
Yeah. I think the interesting thing here is in the sense of, here again, there's more evidence coming out, and they're from what my reading of it is, they're looking forward to another excavation period in October where they plan on doing some more stuff and uncovering more of the church. But let's bring it back to some theological reality. One of the places that Bethsaida appears is in Matthew 11, where it appears with Capernaum, and Jesus is giving this denunciation or denouncement of Capernaum and Bethsaida, because he says, if the miracles that were done in you were done in Tyre and Sidon, they would have repented long ago. And so it's going to be more bearable, more tolerable for Tyre and Sidon in the day of judgment than for you. So you think about, we have this reality of a site now that is becoming more and more evident, that is the real site of this real place that's mentioned in the Gospels, where Jesus mentions this city in a statement of judgment that's coming on the last day. So what if we connect the archaeology with a theological application of us and others, how does this play?
Well, we could look at both of those sites and see how they are just barren ruins today. They were not continuously occupied. We have the ancient cities, but they didn't live on like many other places did. Of course, Jerusalem's been continuously occupied. Nazareth has been continuously occupied. Bethlehem has. We could go on with many, many sites, but those particular two, Chorazin and Bethsaida, are not so. They were abandoned in ancient times and just sat as dusty ruins, or in other times muddy ruins in the case of Bethsaida.
Yeah, it reminds me of this idea that if we were to stand there, go to that site today, on a trip to Israel, or again, Chorazin's another one that's just in ruins. You can go to the synagogue there, but so you stand there and you read this and you go, hey, everybody, look, to me, this is serious business, that here is a real place. There's the stones. And Jesus warns them about the judgment to come in their response specifically to Jesus and the miracles that he did, which authenticated himself as a person, as well as his mission, and as well as faith in him. And so it all comes back. It's a fresh reminder that every single person that lives has to come to that recognition of who Jesus claimed that he was. Bethsaida is going to have an answer. Their time frame, I guess what I'm saying, is on that day. They still have an accounting that's coming that Jesus mentioned on that further day. But each of us have to say, ooh, if it was true for them, isn't it true for us?
We see Jesus also talks about Sodom and Gomorrah too, right? And uses that as another example. And while there's not a consensus on the archaeological sites for Sodom and Gomorrah, there are some possibilities to look at and some evidence of destruction and abandonment and so forth. And it's those cities are never talked about in ancient texts as existing. It's always a reference back to they were there, but they got destroyed. And so similar kind of example.
When we think about, you wrote this book on the excavation, on the archaeological evidence for Jesus, in the gospel specifically, as well as what I appreciated is you talked about the other places outside of the Bible where Jesus appears and the figures of the Bible, of the gospels appear, which is awesome. And I know this is going to be hard, so I apologize, but if you were to give, someone ask you, well, you're on an airplane, you're sitting next to a skeptic, and he's like, well, what do you do? And you tell him, and he's like, oh, okay, yeah, you're one of those guys, one of those Bible guys. And he says, well, give me two of the best evidences, archaeological evidences for the Gospels or Jesus. What do you tell him?
I would probably say something like the archaeological site of Capernaum and then the James ossuary. Even though I know there was a lot of controversy around that, I think it's fairly settled now. So Capernaum, why Capernaum? Well, Jesus lived there. That was sort of his home base for quite a while. And in the Gospels, there are some very specific things that they talk about. Obviously, the name of the village is one, its location, its identity as a fishing village. And then the synagogue is mentioned. And then the house of Peter is mentioned as being right next to the synagogue. And we also, Matthew is there as a tax collector. Well, if we go through the archaeology of Capernaum, we see it's in the first century. It was a fishing village located there on the west side of the Sea of Galilee. And there was a synagogue that was built and in use in the first century in the time of Jesus. And you walk down the street 10 seconds, and there is the traditional house of Peter, which was a house in the early first century, and then in the late first century got turned into a meeting place for the early church, and then they eventually built a Byzantine period church around that centuries later. And it was also on a route in which people would be passing by, so it makes sense that Matthew would be there at the customs house, so to speak. There were Roman soldiers and a milestone that was found from the time of Trajan later. So all those things, they fit details and context really well. As for the James ossuary, why I would say that would be a really important one in establishing Jesus in archaeology is because it's got this inscription on it that says, James, son of Joseph, brother of Jesus, and it's from Jerusalem prior to 70 AD. It's inscribed in Aramaic, and this is a very unique ossuary in that it's got these three names there. So generally the ossuaries have the name of the deceased and their father, or where they're from or their profession. There's only one other ossuary that's got the name of the brother. So it's telling us this brother here, the third name, is very important. And there's really only one person we know who's got this relationship of names from ancient history. And there was even a statistical study done based on population of Jerusalem and percentage usage of names in that period. And it spat out the stat that it would be less than two people who would have that relationship of names. So it seems quite likely that that is an inscription referring to Jesus himself, and then, of course, James and Joseph. And I think that's really important, especially today when many people think or claim that there's no historical or archaeological evidence for Jesus. But not only do we have this inscription, we have numerous historical texts and philosophical texts, not Christian ones, from the 1st and 2nd century that talk about Jesus as a historical person. So, I might use those two as an example.
Again, so here this guy is on the airplane and he's like, oh, I never really knew that. And you go, yeah, I wrote about this in my book if you want to know more. How many total evidences about, again, the archaeology of Jesus and the Gospels, how many do you have in there in your book?
Oh, I'm not sure because I didn't number them, but I I tried to at least talk about every site that is mentioned in the Gospels and every person who is attested archaeologically that's mentioned in the Gospels. So there are many, many.
So dozens.
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh yeah, for
Okay.
sure.
So fair to say, I mean, there's dozens. So let's say you're here with this guy, and he's getting a little humble now, and he's like, oh man, this guy's pretty smart, and I didn't realize that. And he says, okay, well, my final question for you, since I have you here, is so he says, okay, well, you talked about Jesus. Well, what would be? Give me two examples, then, probably the most important that you think. Again, this is all subjective, but what you think are the two best biblical discoveries of all time for the Bible in general? What would you say? I know it's hard, but tell me.
Well, a lot of people would say the Dead Sea Scrolls, but I'm not going to say that one. One, because it gets said all the time, and two, because that's more a discovery for the manuscripts of the Bible. So if I was going to look at some Old Testament artifacts that make a really powerful and impactful case for the historicity of the Old Testament, I would probably say the Tel Dan stele that we talked about earlier, or maybe the Mesha stele, which is kind of similar, and the prisms of Sennacherib. So the Tel Dan stele, when that was found, it actually changed scholarship overnight in a way, because many archaeologists and historians were claiming that David didn't exist. We have no evidence for him outside of the Bible. And then this 9th century BC stele of the Arameans was discovered, naming David, the house of David, as the founder of this Israelite dynasty. So that completely changed the paradigm. The Mesha stele also has that phrase, although it's not noticed as much usually, but it's essentially the Moabite version of 2 Kings chapter 3. Pretty incredible. But then the Sennacherib prisms, this is the story of Sennacherib and Hezekiah that's found in Kings and in Isaiah. And there's an incredible amount of detail and corroboration between the biblical narrative and this Assyrian record of events.
So kind of share the story, share the background here so that people can connect it, because I know where you're going, and I think it's awesome. Kind of connect it for us.
So Sennacherib, the king of Assyria, he invaded the kingdom of Judah in about 701 BC. And if we read the biblical account, it says Sennacherib, king of Assyria. It's during the reign of Hezekiah. Gives us the year that we can figure out, 701. And it talks about how he destroyed or took over all these different towns in Judah, and Lachish, one of those. And then he goes to besiege Jerusalem. And we read that before that, Hezekiah builds another wall to protect more Jerusalem. He digs a new water tunnel to bring the water into the city and make sure the Assyrians can't steal it while they're besieging it. And then in the biblical narrative, the siege stops because God intervenes and kills all these officers and mighty warriors.
185,000, right? The angel goes out, angel Lord kills 185,000 Assyrian soldiers overnight. And they come out, and there's all the bodies. But talk about the Assyrian version of this.
So the Assyrian version follows very closely. There are no discrepancies, really. So Sennacherib talks about his campaign, and then he actually specifies that he took 46 strong-walled towns of Judah. Okay, so that's additional information. The Bible doesn't mention a number, but he says the number because this was glory for him. And then we have the Lachish reliefs that kind of tie into this, and it shows the siege of Lachish and Sennacherib and deporting the Judeans that he defeated. But then it says that he goes and besieges Jerusalem, and he mentions that Hezekiah is besieged in there. He says he's like a bird in a cage. And then he talks about the tribute that the Bible also mentions, and he specifies this amount of gold and silver. Well, what's interesting is that Hezekiah, in the biblical narrative, he gives the tribute, but then it says that he gives all of this extra silver. It's like he tries to bribe Sennacherib to get out of there. Well, in the Assyrian version, the amount of gold matches up, but the silver is even greater. So the amount of money that Hezekiah gave to him was a little bit more than he demanded. But we've got corroboration there. And then the Assyrian narrative just stops. It never talks about the army getting annihilated. And then we just see that later on, Sennacherib is back in his capital of Nineveh. He's gone back there, but there's no explanation as to what happens.
To me, this is one of those instances where when you study historiography and the way that it develops is the people in power get to write the narrative, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And in the ancient world, well, I mean, we do it today too, but especially in the ancient Near East, the official records did not talk about their losses or embarrassments. They would conveniently leave that out, or sometimes they would even spin it a little bit into a more neutral or positive.
This will be my final question, I promise, in that this brings up a great illustration of how the Bible is different than, again, the ancient Near East and their record keeping. So kind of expand on that. How is the Bible different in the way it presents its leaders versus what you just described in the ancient records?
Well, if you look at Assyrian records and you look at Egyptian records and Babylonian records and so forth, whenever they're writing about themselves, it's always their victories, their glories, their greatness, and so forth. But when you look in the Bible, the Old Testament especially, we're talking about the ancient Near East, there are all sorts of embarrassing stories about these rulers and other people. And it's not what you would expect if ancient Hebrew literature or history was written in the same way or with the same methodology as Assyrian or Egyptian or so forth. They don't follow those same conventions. And so while we can be informed and get a lot of helpful contextual information from these other cultures around, they're not the same. And we see, as you said, the uniqueness of the way that the Bible writes about things and portrays the kingdom of Israel or the earlier Hebrews.
As we wrap it up, it just reminds me again of the nature of what we understand Scripture to be inspired. That God is inspiring these people to write about the truth and God's word. And God, they write in such a way where God was critical many times, and their failures are made for everybody to see. But it's a reminder too that these people that we see in ancient times, Hezekiah, great king, others who were great kings as well, David, but we see their failures, but yet also how God used them. And to me, it encourages me as a person that I'm a person of failure for sure, but yet God still does want to use us for his glory.
Yeah, absolutely. Great point there. And it's illustrated really well through those historical narratives.
Well, Dr. Titus Kennedy, I appreciate your time as always. I mean, again, I encourage everybody to get your resources because, again, they've been a blessing to me. And I know that I always try to think in terms of handling objections of those that are skeptical. And I also think of young people. Again, my daughters and others, I was a youth pastor for a long time, and trying to reach those people with objective truth that connects them to the reliability of Scripture. So appreciate your time. Hey, I look forward to having you on again as we get more archaeology coming up.
Thank you. Yeah, I appreciate it too.
Awesome, man. Well, for those watching, again, as always, appreciate your time today as we do this archaeology update. There's always more stuff getting brought out of the ground, and we're going to continue to try to keep you updated. So thanks for watching, and we will see you next time.